morning. Welcome to the Morning Momentum this amazing Tuesday as we get ready to give you a comprehensive rundown of the top stories making the headlines on the papers today. As usual, this is a daily compendium of local and international news, human interest stories, current affairs, and expert opinion. Let's take a look at the top stories inside the Standard this morning. And the top story here, Ruto maintains tough conditions ahead of talks. Now, President yesterday said he is ready for dialogue with the opposition, but he won't be blackmailed using violence, and that power sharing is off the table as his henchmen also ruled out talks on cost of living. That story is beefed up for you on page 13 of the Standard this morning. Also, hopes and fears of school leavers who shunned CUSP's slots. Close to 600,000 students who sat for KCSE last year did not opt for placement to universities or colleges. For some, the cost was prohibitive, but for others, it was out of ignorance. That story is beefed up for you on page 8 of the Standard this morning. Also, in Uasin Gishu County, leaders in eye of storm over botched varsity fund. That story is beefed up for you on page 4. On page 3, Thogoto shame. Elders abandoned, abused in home. That story is beefed up for you on page 3. Under business news, Sosian feeds power to national grid. That story is beefed up for you on page 27. Sports news, after City romp, Arsenal ready for title chase. That story is beefed up for you on page 40. Now, let's take a look at inside the Standard on page 3. Elderly brutally caned, neglected at the PCES home for the aged. Secret filming shows staff members physically mistreating the elderly. They dump food onto tables without any plates, leaving medical conditions untreated. That story is beefed up for you on page 3 of the Standard this morning. On page 4, Mandago says Finland education program was not scholarship. Mandago says registering study program as a scholarship would ease the process for students, but parents hit out leaders for failing to come clean on the program and demand refund for monies. That story is beefed up for you on page 4 of the Standard this morning. On page 6, hopes and fears of KCSE leavers who shunned local university slots. Cost of higher learning was a reason some failed to apply. Others felt they stand a better chance studying outside the country. That story is beefed up for you on page 6. Let's take a look at page 8. Judges reject plea to halt housing levy, grill parliamentary speakers. Say Court of Appeal had already dealt with the matter by unfreezing the Finance Act. 3-judge bench, however, issued a summons to EPRA boss for contempt of court charges. That story is beefed up for you on page 8 of the Standard this morning. On page 10, how powermen helped choir rise and warm heart of State House. It started with a handful of members from Makongeni, Kaloleni, Bahati, and Maringo. Choir had great choir masters, among them Senoga Zake, Darius Mbela, and Eric Wesonga. You can catch up with that amazing story on page 10. Let's take a look at page 12. An ending court battles rage over land previously owned by EATEC. A judge recently recast himself from a case after receiving threatening text messages. Two squatter groups raised damaging claims against each other in fight for 25,000 acres. That story is beefed up for you on page 12 of the Standard this morning. On page 13, no end in sight to chest thumping as Ruto and Raila teams plan meet. President says there must be no talk of handshake and Azimio must denounce protests. Raila issues 30 days notice for talks to have been concluded, failure to which he will call for demos. That story is beefed up for you on page 13. Also, state freezes properties of suspected drug trafficker. A suspected drug lord is at risk of losing his multi-million shillings business empire after a state agency moved to court to seize the assets for being proceeds of crime. You can catch up for that story on page 13. Page 14, judge says courts have no duty to protect unlawful land title deeds. Says those seeking to purchase land have to do higher due diligence since the cartels in the Ministry of Land were becoming more complex. Noted that obtaining a certificate of the official search only was not enough. You can catch up with that story on page 14. Also, Senate committee wants Nzoia water split into 2 farms. The Senate has asked Bungoma Governor Kenneth Lusaka and his Trans Nzoia counterpart George Natembeya to expedite the process of splitting Nzoia Water Service Company Limited. That story is beefed up for you on page 14 of the Standard this morning. Let's take a look at another story. After 25 years of pain, bomb blast victims still decry discrimination. Victims of the U.S. Embassy terrorist attack in Nairobi say U.S. government failed to compensate them. They narrated health complications they are suffering from emanating from terror attack and want Senate to help them get compensation. That story is beefed up for you on page 15. Let's take a look at expert opinion. This is how Kenya can avoid another crippling cyber attack. The government recently disclosed that it faced a cyber attack on some of its key platforms and critical infrastructure on Thursday, 27th July. The attack had a significant impact on service-oriented platforms, including eCitizen, which facilitates essential services such as license booking. You can catch up with that story on page 16. Also, do you support the suspension of WorldCoin? Now, Kakuta Maimai, an MP of Kajiado East, says the whole exercise was questionable, so he is for the opinion of WorldCoin being suspended. On the contrary, Jessica Mutunga, a media practitioner, says no, company was paying good money. Those arguments are there on page 17. You can get to read more insights on them. On page 18, media houses need support to cover climate change adequately. Climate journalism has been in practice for decades, although the ferocious effects of environmental degradation and ecosystem uncertainty may make the sphere to be viewed as a new phenomenon in recent years. You can catch up with that story on page 18. Let's take a look at the Financial Standard this morning. Why food prices might not come down soon. The global headwinds, despite projections of a bumper harvest in Kenya's food basket, outlook remains dim for many households as grain imports experience continued disruption from Russia-Ukraine war, and weakening shilling makes commodities expensive. That story is beefed up for you on the article Financial Standard, page 4 and page 5. You can catch up with it inside that article, inside the Standard this morning. Let's move to the international news on the Standard this morning. Now, bigger BRICS could reset world politics, picking members tricky. Experts estimate that more than 40 states are aspiring to join BRICS. South African diplomat Anid Sukal says 13 had formally applied by May 2023. Also, the Niger coup junta shuts airspace citing military threat. Niger's coup leaders have closed the country's airspace until further notice, citing the threat of military intervention from their neighbors. That story is beefed up for you on page 28. In Somalia, China donates 21.6 million shillings to boost aid delivery. The Somali Disaster Management Agency on Sunday received $150,996 donation from China to support delivery of emergency aid to victims of conflict and national disasters in the country. You can catch up with that story on page 28. Is Khan political future over now that he is in jail? Imran's first arrest led to protests in the streets from Peshawar to Karachi with buildings burning and the army on the streets. Khan is currently in prison, sentenced to 3 years for not declaring money gained by selling state gifts. You can catch up with that story on page 29. Now let's take a look at sports news inside the Standard this morning. And we start with football. Cabra's Sugar determined to clinch overall circuit title. The Millers have switched focus to Christie Sevens after Prince Lou triumph. Cabras are 7 points ahead of second-placed KCB. Also matters golf, big field for Njuri Ncheke Golf Festival. Over 500 golfers are expected to grace the 23rd edition of the Njuri Ncheke Golf Festival, which gets underway today at Nanyuki Sports Club course. You can catch up with that story on page 37. Commonwealth Games, Kenya shines at Commonwealth Youth Games. Team Kenya produced a remarkable performance in various disciplines on the second day of the ongoing Commonwealth Youth Games in Trinidad and Tobago. You can catch up with that story on page 37. On page 38, it's all about the school games. Teams shoulder burden of making their fans proud in Kakamega. The Goreti Mixed kicked off against Butere as Shandarema play Northeastern in football. Nyanza teams Agoro Sare, St. Mary's Yala, and the Nia Girls aim higher as nationals begin. You can catch up with those amazing stories on page 38 and page 39. On the cover page of the Standard this morning, mental block gone. Arsenal ready to push City this season. Gunners made statement with Community Shield victory over the Citizens on Sunday. Ramsdale now feels Arsenal can go toe-to-toe with Manchester City. You can catch up with that story on the cover page of the Standard this morning. Also, another sports news, England beat Super Falcons on penalties. England scraped through the quarterfinals of the Women's World Cup with a dramatic penalty shootout victory over Nigeria despite Lauren James' red card. You can catch up with that story on the cover page of the Standard this morning. We take a quick break and then we come back with the top stories inside the Daily Nation. Welcome back to the Morning Momentum. You are still rolling with the host with the most, Alfonsoh. Now let's take a look at the top stories inside the Daily Nation this morning. First, NYS style drill for students. Now, mandatory 3 months community service after senior school, as well as 9 months upon complementing university and college, will be required of graduates before securing employment if education reforms by a presidential task force are implemented. That story is beefed up for you on page 7. Also, Raila rule out power sharing ahead of crucial talks. President Ruto sustains the onslaught on the opposition, declaring his government will speedily conclude negotiations with rivals so long as power sharing is not on the table. National Assembly Majority Leader Kimani Ichung'wah insists on talks open to public at Bomas of Kenya tomorrow. That story is beefed up for you on page 4. Also, dam scandal. Senator's farm was paid 2 billion shillings for this thicket. In 2009, Middle Water Drilling Company, owned by Mohammed Chute, now Marsabit senator, started construction of Badassa Dam. On completion, it would have stored 5 million cubic meters of water, sufficient to quench the thirst of long-suffering residents of Marsabit town. But today, there is no such water fountain, only a deep money pit in a shrub. That story is beefed up for you on page 12. Also, in transport sector, radical plan for state to control matatu fares. An MP wants the Transport Cabinet Secretary empowered to set statutory fees charged by public service vehicles in various routes nationwide. That story is beefed up for you on page 3. Also, on matters relationship, the law change to end messy divorces. A bill before the National Assembly proposes to amend the law to allow an estranged couple to separate by mutual consent. We'll catch up with that story on page 14. Now, let's delve into the Daily Nation. On page 2, MP seeks simpler, cheaper way for couples to divorce. Now, bill aims to provide more economical way for couples to settle the terms of their divorce. The Marriage Amendment Bill 2023 is before the National Assembly. You can catch up with that story on page 2. Also on page 3, state out to set matatu fares in new law. Experts have called for development of policies to inculcate discipline and restore order instead of price control. New law will give transport CS powers to set minimum and maximum matatu fares. You can catch up with that story on page 3. Let's take a look at page 4. Ruto louds Raila handshake stands ahead of crucial talks. The head of state says negotiations should not revolve around sharing positions in the government. Planned talks between the government and the opposition appear to have been bogged down by trust issues. You can catch up with that story on page 4. On page 5, ICC says Khan has recused himself from Kenyan cases. International Court confirmed receiving communication from Azimio on planned case on police brutality. Prosecutors' visit last week drew condemnation from Azimio leaders. You can catch up with that story on page 5 of the Daily Nation this morning. On page 6, PS put on the spot over missing police and prisons cover reports. Auditor General says her office was unable to evaluate the performance of the contract due to missing reports. Public Accounts Committee members were impressed after the Interior Ministry only provided one report. You can catch up with that story on page 6. On page 7, Dear Gen Z, be ready for NYS style training. Arrangement rekindles memories of the defunct paramilitary NYS pre-university training program. Benchmarking was done with countries like Cuba, Finland, Singapore, and South Korea, where children start community service at a very young age. You can catch up with that story on page 7. On page 8, where is the alcohol? Puzzle container with empty wine bottles. Tons of foodstuffs, including wheat, rice, milk, and juices, are set to be destroyed. Container is among 104 others containing expired goods lined up for destruction at the port of Mombasa. That's very rhetorical. We move to page 10. Azimio leads blast memorial as state officials stay away. Survivors call for medical support pending compensation. Government urged to work together with the US to get compensation for victims. You can catch up with those amazing insights on page 10. We take a look at page 12 now. Kneel to show for Badassa Dam billions over a decade later. The project has since 2008 seen taxpayers fork out nearly 2 billion shillings for nothing more than an expensive trench. Badassa Dam was a key water supply project initiated under President Kibaki's Vision 2030. You can catch up with that story on page 12. We take a look at page 14. HIV infections fall as Nyanza and Rift Valley lead in positive cases. Health official says scaling up of prevention programs is bearing fruit in curbing infections. The data shows HIV prevalence remains higher among women than men. You can catch up with that story on page 14. Also, Kiambu banks on own machines to build more roads. Kiambu County is betting on a new road construction scheme to reduce the cost of such construction scheme to reduce the cost of such projects and have more rural and feeder roads improved. You can catch up with that story on page 14. We take a look at the expert opinion inside the Daily Nation this morning. Working Party report good, but needs to be improved. Would the same argument be used to appoint the county chief to chair referral hospitals, for instance? That is a sentiment by Benjamin K. Sogomo. Also, Ruto shouldn't just lament about, but replace incompetent officials. That is a sentiment by Masharia Gaitho. He says, most of their wide platform rhetoric is about blaming others for inability to deliver. You can catch up with that story on page 17. Also, is divorce process happy and blissful marriage is every couple's dream. The two will have, during their courtship, hopefully learned each other quite well before tying the knot. However, many find out soon after being declared husband and wife that they are, in fact, not compatible at all. You can catch up with that story of easing the divorce process on page 17 under expert opinion inside the Daily Nation this morning. We take a look at county news. We start with Taita Taveta County. Concerns over plan to use pipeline for water. Potential health risks have been raised following plans by Kenya Pipeline Company to use a decommissioned oil pipeline for water supply from Taita Taveta to Mombasa. You can catch up with that on page 19. Also in Bungoma and Trans Nzoia, Lusaka and Natembeya given 30 days to end water farm row. That story is beefed up for you on page 19 of the Standard this morning. We move on to Bomet County. Barchok vows to take prisons officials head on in raging land dispute. The county government has vowed to forcibly take over a 10-acre piece of land next to River Nyangores that is also being claimed by the prisons department and which the devolved unit is eyeing for the establishment of a new dump site. You can catch up with that story on page 20. Still under county news in Kakamega, political rows dim hopes of reviving struggling Mumias. Rai brothers are embroiled in bitter dispute over a word of lease. You can catch up with that story on page 20 as well. On the DN2 article this morning, powering SMEs, all eyes on healthy scoop of earnings in flour enterprise. That amazing story is inside the DN2 article. You can get to read it when you grab your copy of the Daily Nation this morning. Let's take a look at business news. Now, KCB sued for seizure of Beach Hotel over 5 billion shillings debt. The High Court has certified as urgent an application by a director of Pinewood Beach Resort and Spa who is challenging KCB appointment of a receiver manager for the hotel in relation to 5 billion loan for construction of luxurious property in Mombasa. You can catch up with that story on page 24. Also, oil farms woo buyers with discounts amid sales drop. Marketers report declining demand for petrol amid high prices. Hit hard by expensive petrol and diesel prices, some people opt for public means. That story is beefed up for you on page 24. On page 25, inside Mombasa tycoons court fights that keep Imperial Bank depositors anxious. KDIC singles out court cases by Ashok Doshi, who was a depositor and is seeking more than 1 billion shillings from the collapsed lender. You can catch up with that story on page 25. How Jambojet got 2 million shillings fine for firing engineer before he started his new job. Now, airline circumvented best practice in processing the employment, declares judge. You can catch up with that story on page 26 of Business News inside the Daily Nation this morning. Let's now take a look at sports news and get to see the top stories in matters sports this morning. Now, we start with athletics. Fleet-footed granny, 58, just getting started. Priscilla Biwott has been competing for over 40 years at home and beyond borders. During a road race in Belgut, she beat 50 younger competitors. That's amazing. You can catch up with that story on page 36. Also, ex-rugby star Vitisia tops at Muthaiga tournament. Now, this is matters golf. You can also catch up with that story on page 36. Under secondary school national games, hosts Shandarema get the party going in Kakamega. More than 900 students to battle it out for honors over 5 days in 6 venues. You can catch up with that story on page 37 of the Daily Nation this morning. Also, on page 38, Race Walker Ngii to captain Team Kenya in Budapest. The 56-member Kenyan contingent leave the country on Monday for the World event. You can catch up with that story on page 38. On matters football, Bungoma Queens promoted to NSL. Madira Girls Secondary School football team Soccer Assassins on Sunday warmed up for Term 2 National Championships that start tomorrow in Kakamega with a 4-1 win over Kibra Girls Soccer in a playoff match of Football Kenya Federation Women's Division 1 Zone A League. You can catch up with that story on page 38. On page 39, FIFA Women's World Cup, Nigeria an inspiration for Africa. Nigeria's impressive run at the Women's World Cup may have come to an end yesterday, but coach Randy Waldram said their performance had made the football world sit up and take notice. Also, last 16, England survived Super Falcons, scared to reach last 8. Co-hosts Australia also into quarterfinals. That story is beefed up for you on page 39. And as we conclude the cover page of the Daily Nation this morning, Inside States plan to create 1 million overseas jobs per year. Young people asked to enroll in colleges to upgrade skills, as Labour Cabinet Secretary says the government is keen to increase diaspora remittances. You can catch up with that story on the cover page. In numbers, 500 number of recruitment agencies currently registered in the country. This is after almost a similar number were deregistered after they were found wanting. Also on the cover page, sugar barons to import 100,200 tons of sugar as millers are locked out. The government has blocked public and private sugar millers from importing sugar instead of handing the opportunity to business people. With that story of sugar barons, we come to the end of today's morning momentum. Many thanks for choosing to stay with us from the beginning of this broadcast until this moment. I have been your host, Alfonsoh. Special thanks to those who made this broadcast a success. The Chief Controller, Anifa Kavira, John Kariuki behind the camera, and Raphael Wangila at the controls as well. See you tomorrow, same time, same place. Stay tuned tomorrow because we have a great lineup for you. We'll be discussing matters by partisan talks with amazing lineup of guests in studio. See you then, guys. Until then, have a beautiful Tuesday.